Sudan, a nation of rich cultural diversity and historical significance, has been deeply scarred by a tumultuous history marked by prolonged internal conflicts and humanitarian crises. From the ancient kingdoms of Kush and Nubia to the secession of South Sudan and the modern-day heart-wrenching struggles that have torn the country apart, Sudan's story is one of a never-ending crisis. But is the end near yet? In this comprehensive exploration, we delve into the roots, phases, and ongoing implications of Sudan's conflicts and crises. On Africana Histórica, we unravel the complexities of our rich African history, culture, politics, growth, innovation, and legacy. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do so to stay updated on insightful African histories and click the notification bell to know when we create new content like this. Let's dig into today's video to provide you with a nuanced understanding and implication of Sudan's past and present experiences in internal conflicts and civil wars. Sudan is today a pile of ruins, a place of mindless bloodshed, with over 8.5 million people forcefully displaced from their homes, unprecedented hunger, sexual violence against women, and untold war crimes. But did you know that this country was once a citadel of ancient civilization, a place of innovation and peace? However, that was during the reign of the Kushite and Nubian kingdoms, way before the invasion of the region by Egyptian pharaohs, before its radical Islamization by the Arabic sultanates, before the Ottoman conquest of the region, and of course before the power-hungry Mahdist regime, and before the Anglo-Egyptian colonial control of Sudan. That, unfortunately, is how long ago Sudan had known relative peace and progress. So, how did this African nation with a rich oil reserve become a horrific war zone? Let's start from prehistoric Sudan, a time that stretches back over tens of thousands of years ago. Evidence of human habitation in this region dates back to the Paleolithic period, around 60,000 years ago, when early humans roamed the savannas and part of what is now Sudan. As the climate changed and the Sahara began to expand around 8000 BC, human communities adapted to new environmental challenges. This period saw the rise of the Mesolithic cultures, characterized by advanced tool-making techniques and early forms of social organization. Notably, in regions such as Nabta Playa, located in what is now southern Egypt near the Sudanese border, prehistoric peoples constructed one of the world's earliest known astronomical alignments, predating Stonehenge by several millennia. These stone circles and ceremonial sites indicate a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and seasonal cycles, crucial for survival in the harsh desert environment. The Neolithic period, starting around 5000 BC, brought significant advancements. Communities began to settle and develop agriculture, cultivating crops and domesticating animals. This shift from nomadic lifestyles to settled farming marked a major turning point, leading to increased population density and the formation of more complex societal structures. Archaeological sites like Kadruka and Sai Island in northern Sudan provide evidence of early village life, with remains of huts, pottery, and burial sites offering insights into the daily lives and spiritual beliefs of these ancient peoples. These developments laid the groundwork for the later rise of powerful kingdoms and complex civilizations in the region. Prehistoric Sudan was a land of innovation and adaptation, where early settlers not only survived but thrived, setting the stage for the rich cultural and historical legacy that would follow. Kerma was one of the first significant kingdoms in ancient Sudan, thriving between 2500 and 1500 BC in the region of Nubia. Centered around the city of Kerma, this kingdom became a major urban hub with a complex social structure. The city itself featured a large walled metropolis with planned roads, residential areas, a necropolis, and a religious quarter dominated by an adobe structure known as the Defufa. Kerma's strategic location facilitated its rise as a powerful trading center, engaging in extensive trade with ancient Egypt and other regions. Archaeological findings, such as elaborate tombs and grave goods, indicate the kingdom's wealth and connections with Egyptian culture. Notably, Kerma maintained its independence until it was annexed by Egypt during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose I around 1504 BC, which marked the end of the kingdom. and between 1550 to 1069 BC, much of present-day Sudan was part of the new Kingdom of Egypt. Following the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, which affected civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, a new Nubian state known as the Kingdom of Kush emerged. Centered at the confluences of the Blue Nile, White Nile, and the Atbara River, the Kingdom of Kush became a powerful entity in northeastern Africa around 1070 BC. The rise of the Kushite civilization was marked by significant achievements and interactions with ancient Egypt. The Kushites initially rose to prominence in the city of Napata, which became the religious and political center of the kingdom. Around 750 BC, the Kushite king Paye launched a successful campaign to conquer Egypt, founding the 25th dynasty, often referred to as the Kushite or Nubian dynasty. This dynasty ruled Egypt for almost a century, overseeing a period of cultural and architectural renaissance. The Kushite civilization constructed monumental pyramids at sites like Nuri and Meroe, which served as royal cemeteries. These pyramids, distinct from their Egyptian counterparts, reflect the unique architectural style and religious practices of the Kushites. Additionally, the city of Meroe, which became the capital around 590 BC, was a hub of iron smelting and trade.
These Nubian pyramids are over 4,000 years old and are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Despite that though, they're completely deserted. Visitor numbers are tiny, about 15,000 a year compared to the millions that go to the pyramids in Egypt. And due to being completely unprotected, the pyramids and the history here have been damaged and vandalized.
There are more pyramids in this section alone than in the entire Egypt. It's about 220 pyramids. You can notice that most of the heads of the pyramids are chopped off. That's an Italian explorer. He came here in the 1830s and he chopped off like 40 pyramids searching for gold. And we still don't know what he found.
While the Kushites from present-day Sudan ruled Egypt, they adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture, religion, and art, yet they also maintained distinct Nubian traditions. The decline of the Kingdom of Kush began in the 4th century AD, exacerbated by internal strife and external pressures from the war with the Roman province of Egypt. The rise of the Kingdom of Aksum in the south led to invasions that ultimately weakened Kushite control. By 350 AD, the Kingdom of Kush had collapsed, leaving behind a rich legacy. Following the decline of the Kingdom of Kush, the region saw the rise of the Christian Nubian kingdoms, which flourished from approximately 350 AD to 1500 AD. These kingdoms, known as Nobadia, Makuria, and Alodia, were significant cultural and religious centers in medieval Nubia. Nobatia, the northernmost kingdom, was established around the 4th century AD. It was located between the first and second cataracts of the Nile, with its capital at Pachoras, which is modern-day Pharos. Nobatia converted to Christianity in the early 6th century, influenced by missionaries sent by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora. South of Nobatia lay the Kingdom of Makuria, with its capital at Dongola. Makuria became a dominant force in the region, particularly after merging with Nobatia in the 7th century. This unification strengthened the Christian presence in Nubia, allowing Makuria to resist Islamic expansion from Egypt for several centuries. Further south, the Kingdom of Alodia, also known as Alwa, had its capital at Soba, near modern-day Khartoum. Alodia was the largest and most powerful of the three kingdoms. It converted to Christianity around the same time as Nobatia and Makuria, flourishing as a center of learning and culture until its decline in the 14th century. The Christianization of Nubia led to the construction of numerous churches and monasteries throughout the region. Notable sites include the cathedral at Pharos, which was adorned with exquisite frescoes depicting biblical scenes and Nubian saints. Women enjoyed high social status. They had access to education, could own, buy, and sell land, and often used their wealth to support churches. The Nubians also developed an alphabet for their language, Old Nubian, which is largely based on the Coptic alphabet, while also using Greek, Coptic, and Arabic. Despite the Islamic conquests in surrounding regions, the Christian Nubian kingdoms maintained their religious identity through strategic alliances and military resistance. Between 639 and 641, the Muslim Arabs of the Rashidun Caliphate conquered Byzantine Egypt. Between 641 and 652, the Arabs tried expanding by taking Nubia, but were fiercely repelled by the Christian Makurian army. The Arabs withdrew from Nubia, leading to the signing of the Bak Treaty in the 7th century between Makuria and the Islamic Caliphate. This ensured a period of relative peace and mutual respect for religious practices for the next 600 years. Unfortunately, the decline of the Nubian kingdoms eventually began in the 14th century due to internal strife, economic challenges, and increased pressure from Islamic powers, especially around 1315, when Dongola was fully captured by the Mamluks of Egypt. The cathedral and palace of Old Dongola were converted into mosques in 1317. But another surprise struck when the nomadic Juhayna Arabs swept into Sudan from northern Egypt not long after and took Dongola. By 1365, Dongola was no more, and by the 15th century, Islam had eventually conquered all three Nubian kingdoms. Following the decline of the Christian Nubian kingdoms, Sudan saw the rise of two significant Islamic states, the Funj Sultanate of Sennar and the Darfur Sultanate. These kingdoms played crucial roles in the spread of Islam and the shaping of regional politics and culture from the 16th to the early 19th centuries. The Funj Sultanate of Sennar emerged around 1504 when the Funj people established their capital at Sennar, located on the Blue Nile. The Funj were originally pastoralists who transitioned into a settled, centralized state. The conversion to Islam was gradual but solidified by the 16th century. Under the rule of Sultan Badi II, the Funj Sultanate reached its zenith, expanding its territory to include much of central and southern Sudan. The Sultanate's influence extended through military conquests and diplomatic marriages, creating a network of alliances that ensured stability and growth. To the west of present-day Sudan, the Darfur Sultanate was established in the late 16th century by the Kara dynasty. Centered in the region of Darfur, this sultanate was initially a collection of smaller states unified under Sultan Suleiman Solong. Darfur's strategic location facilitated its role as a conduit for trade between the Sahara, the Nile Valley, and the Central African regions. Islam in Darfur spread primarily through trade and the influence of itinerant scholars and merchants. By the 17th century, Islam had become deeply rooted in Darfur's society, with the sultans adopting Islamic titles and incorporating Islamic law into their governance. Under Sultan Ahmad Bukr, Darfur expanded its territory and influence, reaching its peak. The Sultanate was known for its prosperous agricultural production, trading activities, and as a center for Islamic learning. However, by the early 19th century, both sultanates faced challenges from internal strife and external pressures. Both the Darfur and Funj sultanates weakened due to dynastic disputes and were eventually annexed by the Ottoman Egyptian conquest. Despite the fall, Islam remained the dominant religion up to modern-day Sudan. In 1821, Muhammad Ali, who styled himself as Khedive of a virtually independent Egypt under the Ottoman Empire, conquered northern Sudan, aiming to incorporate it into Egypt. Later on, Ismail Pasha led further conquests of Lower Sudan, expanding Egyptian rule over most of modern-day Sudan. The Egyptian authorities made significant improvements to Sudanese infrastructure, but mismanagement and corruption, which were rife in the system, led to civil unrest. In 1881, Muhammad Ahmad, the Mahdi or the Guided One, led a brutal revolt against Egyptian rule, sparking the Mahdist War. Until 1885, Muhammad Ahmad successfully campaigned against the Turco-Egyptian government. To the Ansars, that is, his followers, and those who surrendered to him, he offered a choice between adopting Islam or being killed. He managed to conquer Khartoum in January 1885, but died on the 22nd of June 1885, just 6 months after the conquest. Abdallah ibn Muhammad becomes the Khalifa, or the Mahdi's successor, after Muhammad Ahmad's death and establishes the Mahdist regime. However, tensions persist as the Mahdiya attempts expansion into neighboring regions. Under the Khalifa and his Ansar army, Sudan became a regional power. They invaded Ethiopia, penetrating as far as Gondar, which was an event that later led to the death of King Johannes IV of Ethiopia. They also tried invading Egpit in 1889, but British-led Egyptian troops defeated the Ansar at Tushka, leading to the eventual decline of the Mahdist regime in the region. This gave rise to the growing interests of Britain in Sudan. The British went on to re-establish their control over Sudan, although officially in the name of the Egyptian Khedive, but in reality, they administered the region as a British colony. Because the French and Belgians had also converged at the Nile headwaters, Britain feared that these other powers would take advantage of Sudan's instability to acquire the territory previously annexed to Egypt. Subsequently, Herbert Kitchener, a renowned British Army officer and colonial administrator, led successful military campaigns against the Mahdist Sudan 1898. Kitchener won the Battle of Omdurman on the 2nd of September 1898 against the Mahdists. A year later, at the Battle of Dawaykarat on the 25th of November 1899, Abdullahi ibn Muhammad was killed, bringing to an end the Mahdist War and the establishment of British control over the area. Sudan came under joint British-Egyptian rule in 1899, but was effectively administered as a British colony. The British and Egyptians had divergent visions for Sudan. Egypt aimed for a united kingdom of Egypt and Sudan, while Britain preferred managing the north and south as separate territories. This policy difference set the stage for future tensions and conflicts. Early on, Britain focused on quelling local resistance and establishing control over regions like Kordofan, instituting taxation systems reminiscent of previous regimes. Sudan's border with Abyssinia saw conflicts involving slave-trading tribes, but by 1905, British forces had subdued these areas. Despite efforts to modernize infrastructure and administration, British rule sparked growing nationalist sentiment. British administration saw the formal end to Ottoman rule in the region in 1914. Sir Reginald Wingate was then sent to occupy Sudan as the new military governor, and Hussein Kamel of Egypt was declared Sultan of Egypt and Sudan. His successor, Fuad I, also served in this capacity, but continued insisting on a single Egyptian Sudanese state, even when the Sultanate of Egypt was retitled as the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan. A notable Egyptian scholar and former Prime Minister, Saad Zaghloul, was at the forefront of this struggle, but he was extremely frustrated by the British until he died in 1927. Probably, some zealous Egyptians took matters into their own hands and assassinated Major General Sir Lee Oliver Fitzmaurice Stack, who was the Governor-General of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, while he was driving through Cairo in November 1924. Britain retaliated by intensifying its policy of treating northern and southern Sudan as separate entities. This period also saw the establishment of the Sudan Defense Force, replacing Egyptian troops and reinforcing British military presence. In July 1936, the Liberal constitutional leader, Mohammed Mahmud, take to bring WAF delegates to London to sign the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. This treaty allowed the British military to re-enter Sudan to protect strategic interests, particularly against the expansionist threats of Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini. During World War II, the Sudan Defense Force played a key role in the East African Campaign, countering Italian forces. Post-war, the tide of nationalism surged. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952 marked a pivotal shift, with leaders like Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser abandoning Egypt's claim over Sudan to expedite British withdrawal and facilitate Sudan's sovereignty. This culminated in a vote for independence by the North and South, leading to Sudan's independence on January 1, 1956, after decades of colonial rule that had deepened regional divides and set the stage for future conflicts. Upon independence, Ismail al-Azhari was elected the first prime minister and led the newly formed democratic government. The British and Egyptian flags were lowered, and the Sudanese flag, featuring green, blue, and yellow stripes, was raised. But the new government was probably incapable of handling the new country, especially the growing calls for autonomy in the largely animist Christian South. The north of Sudan has been mainly Arab Muslims, and this was a major problem. On May 25, 1969, Colonel Ghaffar Numeri led a coup d'etat, abolishing parliament and banning political parties. And that was the beginning of an unending wave of internal military disputes which would cripple the country for more than 5 decades. Just 2 years after Khulafar took power, a brief communist coup ousted him in 1971. This was quickly quashed, and he was reinstated. Meanwhile, the North-South Civil War was raging until 1972, when the Addis Ababa Agreement was reached, effectively establishing a degree of self-rule for southern Sudan. The First Sudanese Civil War lasted between 1955 and 1972, while peace only lasted for about 10 years. In the early 1970s, Sudan shifted towards exporting food and cash crops, but the civil war that followed saw the homeland of local tribes raided, looted, pillaged, and burned. Many of the tribe were murdered in a bloody civil war that raged for more than 20 years. Falling commodity prices and rising debt led to economic difficulties. In 1978, the IMF implemented a structural adjustment program with the government, which promoted the mechanized export agriculture sector, but adversely affected pastoralists. Tensions between the North and South eventually worsened when Numeri imposed Sharia law in 1983. One would wonder why to make such an unwise decision, especially when the South is more than 90% Christian and was seemingly beginning to allow peace reign in the country. In 1976, Colonel Ghaffar Numeri survived the bloody but unsuccessful coup attempt by the Ansars. However, on the 30th of June 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir led a bloodless military coup that toppled Numeri's government. Colonel Omar al-Bashir introduced an Islamic legal code and was even tougher than his predecessor. His regime was marked by high-handedness and brutal suppression of his opposition. Al-Bashir purged the upper ranks of the military, banned political activities, and imprisoned opposition leaders. In 1993, he appointed himself president, consolidating his right to power. In 1996, al-Bashir was the sole candidate in a controlled election, establishing Sudan as a one-party state under his National Congress Party. He was elected president in a 75.7% popular vote, and Hassan al-Turabi was elected the Speaker of the National Assembly in the same election, and the new government managed to establish a bit of economic growth in the country, especially with the establishment of oil massive explorations. However, the oil wealth was badly managed and poorly distributed, such that the majority of Sudan's people were still poor. Based on al-Turabi's influence, al-Bashir allowed the registration of legalized rival political parties like the Liberal Democrats of Sudan and the Alliance of the People's Working Forces in 1999. That didn't make any difference because they had very weak support, and al-Bashir was re-elected president in 2000 with 86.5% of the popular vote. However, al-Turabi tried unsuccessfully to reduce al-Bashir's powers as president. Al-Bashir feared they wanted to overthrow him, so he immediately dissolved parliament, arrested, and imprisoned al-Turabi. By that time, Sudan was also suffering from very hostile isolation from the international community. This meant that they couldn't trade their oil and other products at standard market rates, even though the country had rich oil reserves. In the mix of all of these, al-Bashir encouraged Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, an Islamic fundamentalist group, that al-Turabi had earlier invited to operate from within Sudan, to leave the country. He also expelled members of Egyptian Islamic Jihad in order to repair the image of the country with the international community, especially the US, who had listed Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism. Needless to say, under al-Bashir, Sudan was in a lot of political and economic mess. But that wasn't even the height of it. In 2003, the Sudan Liberation Movement, or SLM, and the Army and Justice and Equality Movement, or GEM, began the Darfur conflict, accusing the government of favoring Arab Sudanese. Al-Bashir used a heavily armed nomadic Arab group known as the Janjaweed Militia instead of the Sudanese armed forces, which was preoccupied with a conflict down in the south, to suppress the Darfur movement.
Many people fear are signs of wide-scale ethnic cleansing. People fear that genocide might be returning to Darfur as the rapid support forces and their allied Arab militias appear to be in control of most of the region.
The Janjaweed was headed by a brutal leader called Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, popularly known as Hemedti. The Janjaweed managed to suppress the uproar in Darfur, but with so many killings and human rights violations that led to the conflict being labeled as a genocide. The Darfur conflict even spilled into neighboring Chad in 2005, sparking the Sudan-Chad War, which ended in 2007. In 2006, after 3 years of battle, the Darfur Peace Agreement was signed and peace was artificially restored in Darfur. In addition to these conflicts, a devastating flood hit the country in 2007, affecting over 400,000 people. Interestingly, under al-Bashir, the Janjaweed militia metamorphosed into a state-recognized paramilitary service, which would later be known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. In fact, al-Bashir appointed Hemedti as Abdel Fattah al-Burhan's deputy. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan at the time was the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, thereby making the RSF a support system for the SF. Due to how the South Sudan and Darfur conflicts were handled, both the SAF and the RSF were accused of committing war crimes, leading the International Criminal Court to issue 2 arrest warrants for al-Bashir. Between 1983 and 2005, the Second Sudanese Civil War, Central Sudanese Government, and the Sudan People's Liberation Army. It was largely a continuation of the First Civil War, which had erupted due to the clamor for autonomous southern government, dislike for the imposition of Islamic laws, and of course, regional control of resources. According to official reports, some 2 million people died as a result of the war, including famine and disease caused by the conflict. Following years of war with the central government in Khartoum, the 2005 Nairobi Comprehensive Peace Agreement between the North and South ended the 21-year-long Sudanese Civil War. Following this was the 2011 referendum, in which an overwhelming majority of South Sudan people voted in favor of secession of South Sudan. South Sudan became an independent nation in 2011.
And they see to it that it is free, fair and transparent. We will do it in the presence of the United Nations, and all other people will be present there.
Salva Kiir arrives home to a hero's welcome. And the president of Southern Sudan has good news for his people.
One would think that the troubles of these countries had come to a final end, but you'd be gravely mistaken to think so. Economically, Sudan was in bad shape, considering that most of the rich oil fields were situated in the south, which had broken away. Between 2011 and 2013, another huge conflict broke out in South Kordofan and Blue Nile between the SAF and the Sudan Revolutionary Front, or SRF, over the oil-rich region of Abyei. This ended in a decisive victory for Sudan over South Sudan, and the latter was pushed back after initially occupying the area. This was also linked to the Sudaneseintefada, which was the popular uprisings against Bashir's regime between 2011 and 2013. Multiple clashes happened between the Sudanese government and the Sudan Revolutionary Front. However, the revolts were unsuccessful in removing al-Bashir. Al-Bashir tactically promised he would not seek re-election in 2015 to quell the uprising and calls for his removal from office. But he later broke that promise and sought re-election in 2015. This sparked massive outrage and the eventual boycott of the election by the opposition, leading to an inevitable victory for al-Bashir. This did not go down well with the people of Sudan. So, massive protests broke out all over Sudan in 2019. Initially, al-Bashir employed the protective machinery of his loyal army officers, Hemedti leading the RSF and al-Burhan leading the SAF to suppress the protests. These men had helped al-Bashir remain in power so far by suppressing his opposition and sometimes fighting and smuggling weapons for money in other troubled regions like Libya, Yemen, and Chad. They enjoyed massive funding from the government, while the people of Sudan continued to suffer. But this time, the people had had enough and boldly refused to back down. Al-Bashir refused to step down and, in fact, retaliated by arresting more than 800 opposition figures and protesters. Unfortunately, the crackdown proved very little to help him. The spontaneous protests entered Khartoum, and it became clear to al-Bashir's military leaders that his time was really over.
Familiar slogans from the Arab Spring are now echoing across Sudan. Peaceful, peaceful, they cry, their hands raised and empty of weapons. This was in the capital Khartoum, but for the last 10 days.
On April 11, 2019, al-Bashir was ousted from office through a joint operation by the SAF and the RSF, ending his 30-year rule. A transitional government was established, tasked with guiding Sudan towards democratic elections and stability amid ongoing political and economic challenges. The Transitional Military Council, or TMC, was established by Awad ibn Auf, who only served as head of state for 1 day, from April 11 to 12, 2019. He appointed Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Abdelrahman al-Burhan, the head of the SAF, to lead the TMC, to be deputized by Hemedti of the RSF. Awad then announced his own resignation thereafter. But things got pretty uglier really fast again. The people feared that the country was about to witness another mindless grab of power by the TMC. This led the Sudanese Professionals Association, also known as the SPA, and democratic opposition groups across the country to stage massive protests and street demonstrations, calling on the ruling Transitional Military Council to immediately and unconditionally step aside in favor of a civilian-led transitional government. For 2 months, the negotiations between the SPA and the TMC dragged on, and it was clear that the TMC, headed by al-Burhan, had no intention of handing power over to a civilian-led transitional government anytime soon. So on June 3, 2019, during a sit-in in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum, armed forces of the Sudanese used heavy gunfire and tear gas to disperse the sit-in by protesters, killing over 100 people, with at least 40 bodies reportedly thrown in the Nile River. But there were hundreds of others who were injured.
This was one of the first massacres in history to be live-streamed. At first glance, the footage shows nothing but panic and gunfire. Some demonstrators split off from the crowd, only to find themselves cornered and beaten by the RSF or the police.
Families were terrorized, and according to international media like France 24 and Al Jazeera, several women were reportedly raped by members of the RSF during the June 3rd chaos. The Khartoum massacre led to Sudan's suspension from the African Union. But the civil demonstrations continued. The protests came to an end when the Forces for Freedom and Change and TMC signed the July 2019 political agreement and the August 2019 draft constitutional declaration. This led to the creation of the Joint Military-Civilian Sovereignty Council of Sudan, headed by the renowned economist Abdallah Hamdok as its prime minister. On the 21st of August 2019, Hamdok resumed duty. He appointed 14 civilian ministers, including the first female foreign minister and the first Coptic Christian, who was also a woman. A major achievement of the Hamdok-led government was the signing of the Juba Agreement for Peace in Sudan on August 31st. The Juba Agreement brought together all the warring factions and rebels in Sudan, integrating a large number of them into government. The country was jointly led by the chairman of the Transitional Sovereign Council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. A deal was made to see an election happen sometime in 2023. But that agreement only lasted for 2 years. Al-Burhan and his military chiefs were not comfortable. They wanted more control over things. In a mindless military coup led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, on the 5th of October 2021, the civilian government was deposed and Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok was removed from office. Al-Burhan declared a state of emergency afterward and suspended the constitution once more. He instituted his own government on the 11th of November 2021. But in a move to buy public support, on the 21st of November 2021, al-Burhan reinstated Hamdok as prime minister after a political agreement was signed by al-Burhan to restore the transition to civilian rule.
Sudan's military and civilian leaders have reached a deal to reinstate the ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. He was forced out in a coup nearly a month ago. The army says Hamdok will lead a new independent cabinet. But the main opposition grouping, the Forces of Freedom and Change, says it won't recognize any deal with the military.
But contrary to public outcry, this time, al-Burhan retained full control of the government and sacked all civilian appointees, including military officers he wasn't pleased with. The 2019 Constitutional Declaration continued to be the basis for a political transition. But another massive protest erupted in the streets of Khartoum following public dissatisfaction with Hamdok's cooperation with the transitional military government. The citizens, especially large groups of youths protesting, felt that Hamdok's deal with the military, or the supposed terms of his reinstatement, was a betrayal of the people at best. He had no control over the brutality of the armed forces towards civilians. Neither could he make any effective impact in favor of the people. On the 2nd of January 2022, Hamdok announced his resignation from the position of prime minister. This subsequently shattered all hopes anyone had in the new translational government. Al-Burhan started operating as de facto head of state. By early 2022, he and Hemedti were left at the helm of the government, with the power to direct its democratic transition. This arrangement would later become the current problem the country is dealing with. With Hemedti's Janjaweed militia becoming officially recognized under al-Bashir's government as the RSF, heavily financed by the state, and allowed to control a huge part of Sudan's gold and arms market, Hemedti was clearly not comfortable playing second fiddle to al-Burhan and his SAF.
They're trying to not just win, but trying to eradicate the other in order to have complete control over the country and its resources.
Hemedti played a crucial role in supplying troops to fight for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. His power grew massively, as he had also amassed massive wealth from personalizing public assets and establishing strong international influence with countries like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Hemedti's immense power would become an issue after a weak deal was signed between both men in December 2022 to transition to civilian leadership within 2 years. A major flaw of the deal was that it elevated Hemedti to Burhan's equal, making him no longer the general's deputy. The deal also sought to integrate the RSF into the SAF to form a unified single national professional military body of Sudan under civilian leadership. Unfortunately, this deal did not specify a deadline for the RSF's integration into the SAF. Al-Burhan insisted upon a 2-year process, while Hemedti proposed a 10-year timeline. When the two leaders missed an early 2023 deadline to determine the conditions for the agreement's implementation, it marked a visible and significant fracture in the relationship between the SAF and RSF. This eventually stalled the country's transition efforts. To make matters worse, the friction between al-Burhan and Hemedti erupted into a full-blown civil war on the 15th of April, 2023. SAF troops lined the streets of Khartoum and exchanged fire with RSF soldiers, who were also deployed throughout Sudan. A series of explosions shook Khartoum, along with heavy gunfire, with SAF and RSF leadership both accusing the other of firing first. The United Nations reported that by the third day, 400 people had been killed and at least 3,500 injured. This conflict has resulted in a multi-dimensional humanitarian impact, including the displacement of millions of Sudanese people from their homes, a never-seen-before rise in hunger in the country, as well as the killing of 3 World Food Program workers, triggering a suspension of the organization's work in Sudan.
Homes have been robbed and looted and destroyed, occupied, vandalized, and then there's sexual violence. So it's just one big ball of uncertainty for everyone. What's going to happen to me tomorrow? Is it going to be an airstrike? Will the RSF come and try to displace me from my home? Are they going to try to rob my house looking for money and gold and cars? You just never know.
The conflict in Sudan has been exacerbated by the roles of Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, which have pursued their own interests by supporting the conflicting military factions. First of all, they seem to have a common interest against a civilian-led democratic rule in the country, as both the UAE and Egypt showed support for the 25th of October coup that deposed Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok. Egypt has a long-standing historical and geopolitical interest in Sudan, largely driven by concerns over the Nile River and regional stability. Under President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Egypt has consistently supported General Burhan and the SAF. The Arab Reform puts it this way: in line with its historical behavior throughout post-independence Sudan, Egypt supports the Sudanese armed forces and seeks to create a scenario where the army and its commander, regardless of identity, maintain full control over the country.
I think the answer is that the parties and entities and countries that don't want what's best for Sudan have their eye very firmly on Sudan. And the countries that potentially, or entities that potentially have at least some level of a, sort of institutional or human rights framework that could be used to guide their engagement on Sudan aren't really paying much attention to Sudan. So you have this massive disconnect between the levels of international attention, and almost always it is not in the favor of democratic changes, or particularly the Gulf. And so Sudan is very strategic to these countries. The difficulty for Sudan is that these countries don't necessarily want democratic change in Sudan. And so oftentimes, in fact, more often than not, they have supported a military option.
To achieve this, it has made significant efforts to suppress and impede any path that could lead to the resumption of the democratic transition in Sudan, and, surprisingly, has even coordinated with the Sudanese Muslim Brotherhood and the remnants of the former regime. Egypt has hosted numerous leaders from the al-Bashir regime who continued to plot and support endeavors to sabotage the Sudanese revolution. In the wake of the 2019 ousting of Omar al-Bashir, Egypt sought to bolster the Sudanese military to ensure that any political transition did not threaten its interests. Cairo has provided military aid and training to the SAF and has engaged in diplomatic efforts to support Burhan's leadership. Analysts say that Egypt does not want the emergence of a successful democracy on its borders that could influence and inspire movements for freedom and a transition to democracy in Egypt. On the other hand, the UAE, which is a relatively new player in the Sudan crisis, prefers to associate with Hemedti and his forces to protect its economic and religious interests. The UAE's involvement in Sudan appears to be part of its broader regional strategy to counteract its rival Qatar and expand its influence in the Horn of Africa. The UAE has a history of supporting militias in the region at the expense of official institutions and had supported Hemedti and the RSF, primarily through financial aid, arms, vehicles, and logistical support. Hemedti's forces have played a crucial role in various regional conflicts, including Yemen, where RSF fighters backed by UAE funds have been deployed as mercenaries. The UAE's support for Hemedti is also tied to its interest in Sudan's gold resources. Hemedti controls significant gold mining operations in his home region of Darfur, which have become a vital source of revenue for the RSF. This economic interest aligns with the UAE's broader goal of securing resource-rich allies and controlling agricultural projects, maritime trade, and ports in the strategic region of East Africa. In early May 2023, peace talks mediated by the United States and Saudi Arabia failed after the SAF withdrew from negotiations. Burhan's subsequent expulsion of UN envoy Volker Perthes indicated that his government is wary of international mediation. In response, the U.S. imposed sanctions and visa restrictions on SAF and RSF leaders. Despite international pressure, the violence persisted. In June 2023, the assassination of West Darfur Governor Khamis Abakar, who accused the RSF of genocide, marked a severe escalation. Over 68 villages were reportedly destroyed in Darfur, and mass atrocities were documented by NGOs since fighting erupted in mid-April 2023. Humanitarian conditions have deteriorated, with hospitals and infrastructure targeted. By August 2023, the UN declared the conflict was spiraling out of control, with significant displacement and a collapsing health system. In March 2024, the UN Security Council called for an immediate cessation of violence, leading to indirect negotiations between the SAF and RSF, mediated by Libya and Turkey. However, talks quickly broke down. The SAF's recent advances, partly due to Iranian drone support, shifted the conflict dynamics. According to United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, as of April 2024, 1 year since the crisis began, more than 8.6 million people have been displaced. This includes more than 6.5 million people displaced within Sudan and more than 2 million people who fled to neighboring countries. Chad has received the largest number of people, 571,815, followed by Egypt, 500,000, South Sudan, 135,085, Ethiopia, 33,389, and Central African Republic, 23,086. In South Sudan, most of those arriving are returning nationals who had been living in Sudan as refugees. The country is facing extreme food, water, medicine, and fuel shortages, and nearly 18 million people are facing severe hunger. A World Food Program report released on the 22nd of February 2024 says more than 95% of Sudan's population could not afford a meal a day. A recent peace talk has been scheduled to hold in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. But on May 29, 2024, Reuters reported that Sudan's army has rejected a call to return to peace talks with the paramilitary RSF, following a conversation between General al-Burhan and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The big question is how much more damage must be done before the egos of these two men are fully massaged.